Yeah, so we're going to do it this way. This is going to be my first. So run with me, because my keyboard does neither right, left, any direction. So we're just going to go with, I'm going to click on the slide, and I'm going to tell you about it. First of all, I'm here for you guys. So please interrupt me, ask me questions, challenge me, disagree with me, whatever you want to do. I'm not here, for my edification to give this conversation. So please ask questions. So when I think about the things that we do, and part of this is because once upon a time I ran a startup, and when I ran a startup, I learned that at the end of the day, technology is cool, but unless you're doing something with technology, it really kind of doesn't matter. It's just a really fancy way of spending money. I like to think about what are the business challenges, what are the things that drive why we want to do what we're doing. So at the moment, what we are observing, and I'm observing at a lot of my customers, is this set of business challenges. First of all, virtually every one of my non-startup, non-new company customers is challenged by the fact that we all are changing our expectations of how we want to interact with a business. This is driven by things like Airbnb, Uber. I'm sure you've all heard it. But the reality is, I'm no longer satisfied if my bank doesn't allow me to send a payment to somebody now. I don't want it in 2 days. I don't want it in 4 days. I want it now. Because maybe we are just splitting a bill, and that's the way it should work. I'm no longer satisfied if I submit a quote request to an insurance company, and then I have to wait 2 days until they give me something back. Why can't you tell me what it is now, right? In addition, obviously, we're living in a world of ever-increasing innovation pace. And this is really important because some of us, I'm sure in the room, like myself, have been in this game for about 20, 30, maybe even more years. And we remember a time when we could really stop and think about the new technology. We could really analyze it. We could spend a lot of time with it. Today, it seems like every time I open my cell phone, there's something new that in some way, shape, or form I should probably be paying attention to. And I don't think it's going to slow down, is the reality. So as you grapple as an enterprise, as a larger company trying to deal with this, it becomes harder and harder. In addition to that, we have a world of new market entrants. I don't know if any of you run startups, have run a startup, but why would you do a startup unless to disrupt something or to do something differently or better? Well, obviously, if you are a large bank and Venmo comes along, I don't know if Venmo exists in Canada, but it does in the US, and says, why don't you just use our platform for person-to-person payments? You might not be so happy that suddenly some of your deposits are being shifted to another platform. In addition, the Googles and the Amazons and the Facebooks, et cetera, they're trying to encroach in other markets, right? So Google Pay, Apple Pay is a good example in the financial sector. Suddenly you have somebody executing payments that's not, the bank anymore, not the financial system anymore. And what is next, right? That's just the beginning. I think Google, it was either Google or Amazon recently said that they're actually looking at offering a deposit account. That's, it's unheard of in some ways to cross those kinds of industry boundaries. And then the last one's been kind of a constant, but it is kind of a strong friction point at the moment, which is we are all being asked to do things cheaper. Do it for less money. Can you just do this for a little less? And why is it costing so much to do this technology stuff? So that's sort of the macro view, right? That's what, if I talk to a CIO, if I talk to a vice president, if I maybe even talk to a CEO or president of a company, they would express one of those challenges, if not most all of them. In addition, if we look a little bit closer to home, so what we are looking at is, if you've tried to do any kind of a new project recently, my experience is that when you really started to look at what it costs, it's become more expensive. So just can't do it simple, quick anymore. It seems to be more expensive. At the same time, the speed, by the time you lay out a full project, takes for a really long time, because you have to do this and that and something else, and before long you have like really 17 projects. You don't just have one project. And at the same time, I'm sure many of you, if you're an architect, you every now and then do this fun little analysis of what is my technical debt and how am I doing, and that number seems to always creep up, even though you do great initiatives and put things in and say we should reduce this technical debt, and then a priority comes along and it never gets done. Any disagreements, comments, anything on this? Questions? I see a little bit of head nodding, but I'm assuming I'm waking most of you up at this point. All right, so let's look at it from our perspective, right? I mean, we're working hard. We're doing a lot of work. It's difficult. Like, none of us are like, chilling out at home and sleeping. But the thing that we're observing, and that I'm observing a lot, is that the way that we're solving problems right now is we're adding layers. So we have a system, we have an application, we have something. It's usually too complicated. Either it's an out-of-the-box system, or it's a package like an SAP or an Oracle, or it's a large mainframe, or whatever it is. We're like, changing that's really complicated. Let me just add something on top of it. Maybe a back end for the front end. That is one of my favorites. Let's do a back end for the front end. Because it's just easier to solve a problem that way. Or another favorite of mine is the ESB, which started as a really great idea, but today has so much business logic in it that you have to start to ask yourself the question if it's not actually a business system. So when we look at this and actually analyze what that does, every time we add a layer, we're adding an additional complexity because we're adding yet another dependency between one point and another point. And a really fun thing that you can do sometimes, if you have copious spare time or you have an intern that just started and has nothing better to do, is have them actually create you a picture of your integration complexities. Like, what does it affect when you do a regression? And that becomes mind-boggling. And then play an exercise of saying, what if I added another thing in my ESB or another thing in my backend for the front end? And then you see how many edges get added as a result of that. And you quickly find that it's a near exponential problem every time you make a change. So I would argue, and you can disagree with me, this approach really hasn't worked the last 5 years, so we probably should stop doing it. So when we look at that, what should we do differently? Now, we had a Reactive summit, so I'm hoping I don't have to teach anybody what the Reactive manifesto is. If I do, then let's talk afterwards. But the principles in many ways apply here, but the two big things that I want to highlight is we need to stop doing big bangs. This concept of let's replace this massive system, let's do this large transformation, let's do this massive change, is first of all extremely difficult to do. Second of all, by virtue of the nature of the beast, never achieves the goals, because you have to set goals a year, 2 years, 5 years in advance, and then you set down exact scopes and exact timelines and exact everything is nailed down. And guess what? In 5 years, you don't actually want that anymore that you came up with 5 years ago. But if you delivered what you came up with 5 years ago, you just wasted a lot of money. Yeah, then we usually make an explanation of, oh, but the technology has been evolved. It's going to be easier afterwards. Some of that is true. But at the end of the day, unless you deliver value to your business, was it actually valuable? So the other part is, I challenge that we as technologists have spent too much time digging into technologies, thinking about, oh, what is the latest, greatest thing? I'm trying to think of a good example, but like the holy wars of Kafka, Kinesis, Akka streaming, or how to integrate APIs in SOA architectures, or any of the variety of things. And we love to debate those. And it's great stuff. That's our discipline, right? But the question that I have to ask, what value does it deliver? What does it actually do for the balance sheet of our business? What does it actually deliver? So what I challenge is that as technologists, we have to think full stack. And I know that full stack is a term that's been used between front-end and back-end guys, but that's kind of why I like it. Because I argue that full stack is a new discipline of looking at business challenges and opportunities, connecting it with technology, and connecting it to data, because data ultimately drives our businesses. Technology is just the functionality on top of it. Any thoughts on that? Well, that's a good starter. All right, so you're probably saying like, well, okay, it makes sense, great, fantastic, but what are we going to do about it? So one of the things that I do professionally, and which I'm really excited about because I've been in enterprise IT in some way, shape, or form, either as an actual IT employee or as a consultant for now 20-some, I'm getting close to 30 years, which is kind of scary. I feel old. And I've really not seen something as interesting in a while, is this concept that with some of the technologies, but also with the principles of reactive, we can actually go and start to break out of this restriction that we have. Because we're in this restriction because at some point in time, we put some system in place, and then we kept making investments on the system. And really, that system has started to define who we are, what we are, how we run our business, and everything else. Because we coded something into it, sometimes 30 years ago, and we're still saying we can't do X because it's that way in the system. So when we think about this, if we can get some of the information that sits deep in our systems, and those are mainframes, those are Oracle, those are SAP, those are a variety of applications that have been around for a long time. If we can get some of the information out, remember I said the data is at the core of what drives our business. We can get some of that data out and get access to it and start to do something with it, then suddenly we can actually use some of these cool things that we keep talking about, these microservices, these reactive concepts, well, my personal favorite is Eventdriven. I'll talk about in a second on why that is. So I'll give you a quick sort of top-level view, but I'm going to drill in a little bit in that. So if we think about today's IT architecture as something that's sort of a stack, right? You have an online layer, you have a legacy core, well, whether it's legacy or not, depending on the day, it's just a core, it's the thing. Usually we have some form of BI and analytics, we're taking some data out, we're doing something with it on the side. And then we have some corporate functions underneath it because PeopleSoft as an ERP has got to make some money as well. And the argument that I make is if we can go and get some of the data, which we're already kind of doing for DR purposes, we're already kind of doing for some of the analytics function, if we can get some of that data out of that core system, and let's use some of the data to build some new things next to it. Sometimes as simple as let's put it in a data lake and see if we can do some interesting transformations on it, but let's not do it in the platform. Let's not do it on top. And if we start to service enable it. Now, that one is sort of this is a slide that we use sort of in a general concept way. Many times there's some form of service already available, right? So let's just leverage it. But also the other part is let's start making it a little bit more real time. I'll talk a little bit more about that because it's actually an interesting challenge, but it's actually surprisingly simple to do. And then, well, we all like cloud, but I'm going to be really clear. I have a lot of clients who are still skeptical of public cloud, either because of the risk involved, because of regulatory obligations, because of a variety of other things. I personally love public cloud because the idea that just push a button and I have something is a heck of a lot easier than the days when I had to rack a server. But at the end of the day, if you're not, you can use cloud-native technologies in your data center. Red Hat would love to talk to you about OpenShift, and that's just one of them. You can do pure open source using Kubernetes, so many choices. So in the end, what we want to get to is we want to start to diminish what that core system is. So that's no longer this big behemoth. We start to take some things out. Strangler pattern, if you're not familiar with it, is sort of the principle that we apply here. We're saying, okay, what shouldn't be in the core? If you're an airline, what should be in your reservation system? Probably just a reservation, not some part of your loyalty and some part of your operations, and something that maybe does a little badge that shows up on your profile and all the other stuff that has been piled in over the years. So let's start lifting some of that stuff out because it doesn't belong here. And in the end, we can brittle it down to actually the core. And maybe that system that we have is actually really good at that. So let's leave it at that. So that's the end state on the right is we have a specific legacy, we have a specific new, and we can build things around it that drive differentiation, drive services, and give us real time. So a word of caution on this. I've seen this a surprising amount. So a number of clients that I work with have started journeys. They said, we're doing microservices. Awesome. When you look at the microservices, each microservice calls each other, does a direct hard call, REST call to each other. That's really fantastic. When you draw the dependency diagram, it looks exactly the same as what it did before when it was in legacy. So exactly what did you gain? You actually kind of made it more difficult now, because now you have hundreds of services. At least before you had one big system. So we don't get value if we can repeat the patterns of the past. So When I look at this, what I really want is I would like to leverage this concept of event-driven. And I'm really excited about that. The idea that we can take things, changes, things that are happening in our enterprise, and turn them into essentially state emissions via events. And if you start to think about it, this is kind of like what we learned in computer science a long time ago on how a state machine works, except now we're doing it sort of in a large scale. So let's take an example here. I'm going to start with the microservices. If you have a microservice that, let's say, is responsible for managing a customer profile, and that microservice, let's say you're creating a new customer. A new customer where an API call is created from a web front end, right? So if that customer service goes and just emits the state that the customer was created, we have a new customer, into an event stream, suddenly we can do some cool shit with that. So there may be a marketing system that maybe wants to send them a welcome email. So if that's in the event stream and we have the state, the system can just listen to it and say, hey, new customer, hey, I'd like to send them a welcome email. Maybe there's, if you're a bank, maybe there's a branch manager in a responsible branch who wants to give you a call. Seems very expensive, but you get the idea. Maybe there's an analytics system that wants to keep track of how many new customers have you had. If we can remove this into this visibility of an event stream and make these states visible, then suddenly we can do a whole number of things without having to do calls deep into the databases of a core system, which is a difficult thing. Now, the second part is, when you look at a legacy system, virtually all legacy systems follow a very simple principle. You have some kind of a input. It's actually very often batch, but it is also some amount of online. The input runs through a whole bunch of business logic. And at the end, the state gets persisted to some form of a data store. It's how we've been designing software for 20, 30 years. So if you can observe the transactional change in the data store through, for example, a CDC tool, if it's a relational store like a DB2 or an Oracle database, and can take that change and put it into an event, you have just turned a legacy system that is really, really difficult to work with into a system that emits states into your event stream. And now that you can see those states, you may see that we just granted a new loan to a customer, and you might want to send them a compliance email from a marketing system. So if we can see that that loan as a transaction has been applied to the database, and we can emit it into an event stream, now we can even leverage information out of a legacy system in the new through the visibility that exists on the event stream. Any questions, comments, thoughts, disagreements? I'll take it all. Let's wait. Apparently we're videoing this. I don't understand why anybody would want to watch me talk, but so they want the microphone.
I was thinking that the CDC tool sounds pretty cool, but I'm wondering if there's kind of another strategy to emit the events elsewhere in the legacy system, maybe before you do the write, or maybe when the service gets called, or if there's some sort of like generic way to put events into a legacy system.
So the interesting part is the reason why I like the CDC tool, and there's many other ways. So you can connect the transactions in a legacy system. It kind of depends on the legacy system in that moment. The cool thing what I like about the CDC tool is that thus far, with extremely few exceptions, has it worked consistently. And it doesn't require me to really change anything in the legacy system, which is usually an expensive and complicated task. So while we absolutely go, and there's great examples where we have to go into messaging via MQs so that we can interact with the legacy and can make it kind of part of this sort of event-driven system. And absolutely we need to do that, particularly as you think about how do you have a coexistence between the systems, right? And that's really where the interesting challenges happen along the way. Because when you take a system apart, like an insurance system, for example, and you may want to take out the part that does the initial quotation, But at the end of the day, the underwriting and things like that still happen in the legacy system. You may need to hit the legacy system for a quick validation on some high-level underwriting rules that you're not going to take out right away. So in that moment, you have to set up some kind of a facade for the legacy system so that the legacy system can interact in that event-driven architecture and emit states that way. So for specialty items, you absolutely have to do it around coexistence. I find that the effort to do that needs to be very targeted to where it's valuable. Because otherwise, if you have to, I mean, that's the approach we did before. And IBM, as a mainframe, for example, will sell you great tools that will API enable your mainframe. And after about 2 years and a lot of headaches and a lot of money, yes, you kind of API enabled your mainframe. But you added MIPS to it, so now you're paying them more, and you've added complexity to it. So that's kind of sort of the, does it make sense? Any other questions, comments? All right. I'm going to kind of fly through this, but this is the guts. But one of the things that I observe is that this is actually surprisingly difficult for as simple as it sounds. And there's some things that I've observed that people tend to struggle with. So I want to talk about them a little bit. So the first one is structure. When we start to build new things, we should try to not repeat the mistakes, and they're not really mistakes. I actually hate. Let me reset myself, because I built systems with SOA architectures, and I don't think it's a good idea today. But at the time, it was the right choice, right? So when we build these new things, let's try to use the latest thinking to make them better, to make them more flexible, to make them more sustainable in the future. So the first one to me is, remember when we started this conversation, we talked about what would the business care about, and why am I motivated by the business? Other than that I, once upon a time liked to play in startups. The reality is that change in our systems is usually driven by the business. So if you think about it, any time that you get a request to change something, if you're running some kind of an application, most likely you weren't sitting around the table and it's like, hey, it'd be kind of cool if we kind of, made a little bit of a change over here. But most likely somebody that's interacting with your customer, that's running your business, that maybe has a compliance need, came and said, hey, we should make this change, or can we do this, or can we improve something? So the reality of that is we should align our application from a domain perspective, from how we structure it, to the structures of our business, because that means that there's going to be a one-to-one relationship between the change and where the change goes. This is commonly referred to as domain-driven design, but this principle of starting to think about, if you create a service, does that service align with what your business is doing? Are the responsibilities isolated that way? Because then you're creating the same boundaries that exist in your business, and most likely the ties, the things that connect those two, will remain structured as they are because your business doesn't constantly reorganize itself. That make sense? The second part, state, is considering it's something that we probably all learned in computer science once upon a time, I find it surprisingly difficult to work with. When you start to think about what is state, and state in a single change in a system, because when you can break it down to a single change, problems actually become pretty simple. When you can start solving simple problems, then it actually becomes a lot more flexible, and you're no longer challenged with trying to understand huge complexity. So the state, this idea that when one change happens, the customer updates their profile. This is a change of state. The interest rate for a loan changes. This is a change of state. Any of those things, if we can start breaking things down to changes of state, it actually is surprisingly powerful because it drives all of our deterministic systems. So thinking about things in terms of state and evolution of state seems very simple, but most of the time I find people struggling with it because it's a different way of thinking of it. We're used to thinking in commands. We're used to thinking of, I have to tell you to do something, rather than thinking, oh, I should just let the world know that I'm at this state. And then it's the responsibility of somebody else to figure out what they do. Because if you think about it, if you're responsible for the customer as a person, not as a system, right? As a person, you're responsible for the customer. You only care about what the customer. Did they move? Are they happy? Things like that. You don't care what the account system does with the customer. It should worry about that part. So really all it should be is you tell the world, hey, customer moved. I don't know what that means. That's the account system's responsibility to think about that. It shouldn't be the responsibility of who manages the customer. So the final one is speed. We have, for so long, gotten used to concepts that move once a day, once a week, that's processed at once a month. It's part of what's breaking our customer experiences. We have to start thinking about, can we move things and can we process things in real time? And the reality of it is that actually solves huge problems. Because if you think about the reality of what we're doing with batch processing today, where we're trying to cram in tons of computation that has to happen in a very confined window because we can only take the online system down for so much time. Or we have to do some kind of a store and forward process where while the batch system is processing because it's not syncing state with the online system, we have to somehow apply the changes and all this complexity. If we could just do a really simple change in the online system in real time and be done with it, it's so much easier. So it eliminates the complexity of these massive processing things. And when we can start breaking the problems down into small services, into small things that we can scale, that we can that can consume our resource pool in ways that best benefit it, it actually ends up being a much easier problem. Any questions, thoughts on this? Cool. Key success principles. Some of those you guys probably know. First of all, build for failure. If you've ever run operations in a data center, you know it happens. Hard drives fails, power goes out, all kinds of shit happens. You make great plans, reality kicks you. The second part, don't repeat the past, right? Learn from it, and then do something better. The last one, if you're going to undertake a transformation, if you're going to undertake a project, I challenge you to not take your technical debt with you. This is really difficult. I literally this morning on one of my projects had to advise one of my guys. And these guys, they do this every day. I had to say, just because it was that way in the old system is not a reason to do it this way. We have to ask the question, why is it that way? Should it be this way? Does that actually create business value? So try to disconnect yourself. If you're going to rewrite something, if you're going to write some new thing, even if it's tiny, try to disconnect yourself from the old. Try to ask the question, what should it be? Rather than, that's how we've always done it. Because otherwise, the value of your activity, which probably is fairly expensive, is quite limited. Thoughts and questions? Headphone.
That's a really hard thing to do, though, because people are attached to the way they do things. And you ask them, why do you do it this way? Sometimes they don't know, but they say, we must do it for a reason, therefore we must continue doing it. This is really hard.
It is very, very hard. Yes. But how many millions of dollars are companies spending on these activities? I mean, if we are talking about $10, okay, doesn't really matter. But if you're spending, I literally am observing, just within my view of business, hundreds of millions of dollars spent on these kinds of transformations. I mean, I challenge, if your company spends that kind of money, shouldn't you take that extra effort to dig into it? Should you really get the business involved, really talking with them about it? Because it actually enables you to rethink how you should work. Yes, it's hard. I don't challenge it at all. And it's not always easy, because you may be on a tight timeline. You might be wanting to get out of an infrastructure contract that you're in. So, there's other drivers in your business case. But you should always try to ask the question. You should always challenge. You're not going to be 100% successful. But if you don't start with it, If you just from the beginning say, let's just do a one-to-one, then really what did you gain? All right. Again, probably obvious, but I personally like the quote, so that's why the slide always stays. Keep yourself out of trouble. You know, the small components, look at singular purpose, executing simple tasks, bounded functional contexts, all of which can be easily described in one sentence. I always challenge my team, if you write something, if you create a new service, can you explain it to your mother, what that thing does? If you can, great. But if you're like getting into like a deep discussion about it, you might want to think about whether you should simplify this thing. And I'll abstract a little bit. Sometimes in the world of business, we have business rules. I'm not saying that you can necessarily explain every single business rule with it, but you should be able to explain what this thing does, right? Obviously, avoid the direct dependencies and remove unnecessary complexity. We kind of talked about it on the previous slide. It's challenging, and then I put it down there. This is really hard. This isn't easy to do. It sounds easy, but only then do you get the value of doing the activity. Cool. Second part, well, talked about it for the most part, and this is really all around reactive. Failure happens. Let's just be real. I'm still amazed at how many customers up to CIO level say, so what are we doing to guarantee that there's no failure? What do you want me to do? Do you have a magic hard drive that never fails? Because I don't. So let's, rather than say, let's not have failure, let's actually manage when failure happens. And let's make it so that our customers, the people that actually pay us, they should never know the failure happened. That's the important part. Other than that, stuff can fail all the time. But we should be resilient enough. We should be able to handle that failure in a way that we can come back. Finally, this is one of my personal favorites because I started my career as a system and network admin. I love the cloud stuff and the Kubernetes, and now we're just doing Docker containers. And that's great until suddenly your information isn't flowing the way that you expect it to. And you're looking at your containers, and you're like, why isn't this working? There's still a network underneath it. There's still hardware underneath it. There's still those pieces there. If your routing isn't correct, there is no magic that the Kubernetes orchestration can do for you. If you have too small of bandwidth, there's no magic we can do to fix that. There's still hardware and infrastructure. And finally, there's people involved. They're, to me, the top of the stack. And all of the people that work to us, from the developers to the business analysts to the product owners to the Scrum Masters to probably the Agile that we're not truly doing, but we're doing what I like to call Wagile, which is waterfall Agile. All of those people, they have to come along for the ride. This stuff doesn't work if you're doing like 2-year waterfall projects. Next one. I bet some of you have lived this. One of my favorite examples of this is I had a client once that brought my team in to say, we do not understand why our application fails. It keeps constantly going offline. Our customers are pissed, but we've built all this stuff to make it redundant. But they didn't pay attention where the internet connection went. They had redundant internet connections, except they both went to the same POP in the city. When that POP experienced an outage, so went their data center. So it has to be 3 of everything if you want 5 nines, or 2 of everything if you want the 4 nines. Everything, down to the last bit. Because it's that tiny little thing that you didn't think about that's going to, in the end, cost a failure. Now, what this means, when we think about microservices, there are some new paradigms in there. How do you do 3 of everythings with data? If you've ever used Oracle's geographic replication feature, you probably have gray hair. So that stuff is difficult. There's some new paradigms. There's some new databases that are coming out based on Raft consensus driving, so that you can actually do distributed database data at scale. There's new ways of moving event data around. Some of that is still challenging today if you don't have high-speed connections. So all of those things that we need to work through. And in the end, a really important part is, in order to be able to have these multiples of everything, we need to think of applications as fundamentally stateless, because only then can I have 5 of them running. Questions, comments? The last one is an often forgotten one. This stuff is hard. Abstract some problems, automate them. Then things do work the way that you expect them to. You're defining things in code. My favorites are behavior-driven design and testing, where you define things as gherkin and run automated tests over it. Should always be test-first development. Why? Because not only does it make sure that the stuff is what we expect it to be, but if you ever observe the development team, when you do test-first development, as part of figuring out how to write the test, they have to actually understand the problem. So they start asking questions. They start digging into things. And that removes the assumptions that they would otherwise make when they're building it. So that when they actually build the code, they're actually building what they're supposed to build and what you're expecting. Automate everything that you can possibly automate. Deployments, validation, scaling, failure recovery, detection, all that good stuff. I'll also tell you, there is no human QA person that is better than a machine. Doesn't exist. Disagree? We'll talk afterwards. We'll talk afterwards. I may agree with you on a certain aspect. I think the human is good at testing things that we cannot define to the machine. So I'll give you that. But when we expect the human to execute a script that says step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, here's the output that you do, which is what QA has been. The human, in my experience, always makes more mistakes than the machine. Okay, let's put it together. I always like to sort of, everything previous was my non-opinionated point of view. This is my opinionated point of view. When we all put this together and we've started to term the coin red architecture for reactive event-driven architecture, this is what we see. Now, we've added a little bit of a bit to this that we are actually very proud of, and I'll talk a little bit to it, which is this concept of a reactive interaction gateway. What this is a gateway that allows you to extend the event model and the data stream into your UI, so that your UI can participate in the reactive system. This is essentially using WebSockets, but there's some really smart things in there that make sure that you can scale that. I'll talk to that in just a second. The other part is, the reason why this is really exciting is now that you're starting to have this democratization of your states, of your data, of what's going on in your company or your organization, you can actually do some really cool stuff with analytics and AI. Because it's no longer I have to ship it off somewhere to the side and process it and do a whole bunch of ETLs on it and create a perfect data model and do a bunch of stuff. No, I can actually look at the evolution of states that are happening in my organization, and I can apply intelligence to it. And the result of the intelligence in and of itself can be a state in the system that we use to evolve and drive new experiences, new capabilities, new decisions. Thoughts, questions? All right, then I will get into sort of the final part. The reactive interaction gateway, it is a tool that allows you to do essentially an API gateway, but it drives socket, server-side push at scale, fully distributed. Essentially, it's a cloud-native tool. As such, it just shows up on the cloud-native canvas. For the CNCF. We always love contributors. It's an open source project, so we built it, but we have open sourced it. We have people who are contributing to it. We have an increasing amount of users with it. So if you're interested in it, check it out. It's a really cool tool. For those of you who like, to think about actor systems, it's actually built in Elixir, which is a very interesting actor system. It's based on the Erlang VM, which Ericsson built to drive their phone switches, so it's extremely resilient. So that's kind of cool. The other call out that I want to make is we are very involved in a initiative called Cloud Events, which you can find at cloudevents.io. It's sponsored by the Linux Foundation and CNCF. It aims to create a standard for events, period, so that we can actually interact based on events. So please check that out, help contribute to the community. It's a really good group. It brings together a number of heavyweights, so you can find Amazon, IBM, Microsoft, Alibaba, Waymo, all contributing. So it's actually a really good group. And obviously the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, which I think is really driving some of the thought leadership and sponsoring some very interesting projects in the space. And then, I would be obliged to say this. We are very busy doing this work. If you're looking for an opportunity or you're interested, we do a ton of this work. We have, alone in this region of Canada, I'm responsible and overseeing, I think, 3 or 4 projects right now. So we're always looking for smart people. Either talk to me, talk to the folks at our booth. So we're always welcoming new folks. That's it.